All right, here's the video that I wanted to take a look at together. The fall of Destiny 2. Let's take a look.
Corporate greed, terrible leadership, and bad game design. These are three of the many things that contributed to the fall of Destiny 2. Destiny used to be one of the biggest and most beloved games, but now over 95% of its players have left, and most of its content creators are being forced to cover other topics or quit the game entirely. Today, we are going to analyze why all of this happened, and we're going to break down the timeline of bad decisions that ultimately led to the downfall of my favorite game.
Let me also point out on the whole, like, covering other games, we watched like all kinds of stuff. So we've been doing that for a long time.
Before we get too deep into it though, we've partnered with Geology to bring you this video. Geology is an award-winning hair and skincare company that delivers simple and effective routines that will be customized precisely for your exact needs.
Yes.
After you take a 60-second quiz, you'll get access to a personalized product that is made with ingredients. And based on all these reviews and awards, it's clear that their product is the real deal. I know a lot of men out there don't take their skincare as seriously as they should, and they realize that it's important. So if you want to start looking your best, we have a great opportunity to get you started. Thanks to Geology for partnering with us on this video, and now let's begin.
By the way, I'm not skipping Shadow's ad here because I'm saying it's not important. It is very important. I'm super selfish and would rather you use code Aztecross for your Geology needs versus code Shadow. But in this particular case, use code Shadow.
Begin our story about the fall of Destiny. Before we can talk about the more recent decline of the game, we first need to go back and discuss the mistakes that were made way back in Destiny 1. A huge amount of people quit the game back then, and of course, this contributed to the eventual fall of the franchise. See, when Destiny was first publicly revealed and then showcased in 2013, the hype and expectations were sky high. We were promised that the story would be as recognizable as Star Wars, that the world would be huge and expansive, and that we would have all of these epic planets to explore. But that brings us to our first—
Dude, what was pitched to me, I was kind of like, I was going to play Destiny, but like, I wasn't like looking at every single thing that they were talking about. But what was pitched to me was it's going to be Skyrim in the stars.
Recurring issue, and that is disappointment. When the game first went live, we found out that the story was a disaster, the scale of the game was a lot smaller than it was supposed to be, and half of the planets that we were promised weren't even in the game. The story in particular was extremely bad, having terrible writing, zero motivation, zero clarity, zero explanation of anything, and then the game literally told us that it didn't have enough time to explain its own story. Many players were angry about all the broken promises, and although it was clear that the game did have a lot of potential, this was still a disappointing launch. This ultimately damaged the game quite a bit because as a bunch of players tried it out, many of them just permanently left due to the game under-delivering and being somewhat disappointing. As time went on, many more players continued to quit during the content droughts of the following two expansions. The Dark Below and House of Wolves certainly brought some good things like the Raid and Trials of Osiris, but ultimately they didn't fix any of the issues that everyone was complaining about. The following year though,
I would say this. I mean, Angry Joe, and nothing against Angry Joe. I thought House of Wolves was fantastic. Like, House of Wolves was what made me like I was already in love with Destiny. Now I was already embedded in the game, but House of Wolves to me was like the thing that just like full sent it for me, man, with Trials of Osiris. And the numbers were insane. Y'all remember how big, like at one time, Trials of Osiris completely took over the Twitch directory. So many people were playing Trials of Osiris. It was new. It came out of nowhere, or at least it seemed like it came out of nowhere. So yeah, you had your players that definitely left the game initially from vanilla. And I completely understand why, because maybe they expected that Skyrim in the stars. But for the rest of us, like, no, it wasn't like the best content ever, but House of Wolves was really good. I look back fondly on the Dark Below era, but we'll continue here.
Though, the Taken King expansion actually addressed all of those issues and vastly improved every single thing about the game. This was a huge highlight, and the game was a whole lot better for a while, but then we just entered yet another content drought. You might think that we have content droughts in the modern game, but these content droughts back in the day had no seasonal missions, no sandbox updates, no new loot or activities, no new story. Literally nothing happened for months, and this caused the game to bleed and lose quite a lot of players. Even though they enjoyed the Taken King, such an extended period of zero content would cause many of them to lose their habit of playing and then ultimately never return to the game. The sequel game, called Destiny 2, was set to launch the year after, but we were once again disappointed as the developers at Bungie decided to delay the game for an additional year. Instead of Destiny 2, we got Rise of Iron, which was just okay. It didn't move anything forward in a meaningful way, but overall it was just a good expansion and people really liked the new raid. At the very end of Destiny 1, we had the Age of Triumph event, which was indeed awesome, and it set the expectations extremely high for Destiny 2. Unfortunately though, these expectations would not be met.
Yeah, again, and it's one of those things. So I liked Rise of Iron. I thought Rise of Iron was fantastic. And of course it was it was filler content. However, Rise of Iron, Age of Triumph, I thought that whole year was really, really solid. And the only reason why the numbers even dipped off is because a lot of people said, why should I invest more time in a game that no one's going to be playing in 6 months to a year? And that's the only reason why the numbers may not have been that strong. But the expansion itself was really good.
The following year, people thought that the launch of Destiny 1 was pretty rough, but somehow they managed to make the launch of Destiny 2 even worse. Although the story was quite excellent, everything else like the loot, the PvP, the activities, the subclasses, the ammo system, the weapons, the armor was a complete disaster. Once again, this was a period where our expectations were extremely high, and then we had to come crashing down to a disappointing reality.
Here's the thing about the D2 vanilla launch. It was as if two separate teams not only made, which we know how the way the expansions work is like things would always be staggered. There would be a team that would work on, say, vanilla launch for Destiny 1, another team separately working on Taken King, Rise of Iron, D2 vanilla, and Forsaken and whatnot. And so these teams would stagger. The issue from Destiny 1 to Destiny 2, it was as if neither one of those teams communicated whatsoever on what made Destiny 1 magical. And there was just a huge separation between those two games, which is why we had such a severe player drop-off with D2 vanilla.
We assumed that Bungie would have learned from their past mistakes, but unfortunately we got a half-baked product that was worse than Destiny 1 in many ways. In fact, some players were so disappointed that they wanted to just go back to Destiny 1 and abandon D2 altogether.
Some of us did.
This disappointment surrounding the launch was catastrophic for player retention, much like it was during the original launch of 2014. This was only amplified because many players were giving Destiny a second chance, but then they felt like they got burned by Bungie for a second time. In addition to the returning players though, there were also millions of new players who were trying out the game, and especially with Destiny 2 coming to PC, this was our big chance to go mainstream and become one of the biggest games on the market. For a few days, we actually did succeed, with the game actively surpassing 1 million concurrent players. All of the big streamers were covering the game, it was everywhere on the news, and this was a huge moment for the community. Soon enough though, the hype died down, and we all noticed the flaws like the token system, the microtransactions, the slow gameplay, and the complete lack of endgame content. The player count plummeted to dangerously low levels, and especially with the release of the terrible Curse of Osiris expansion, it looks like Destiny might not even survive for the next year. Fortunately for us, Bungie absolutely cooked the following year, and they delivered Forsaken, one of the greatest expansions the game has ever seen. They finally removed the awful weapon system where players could only use 2 extremely weak primaries, and they brought back special weapons that made the gameplay feel much faster and more interesting. The amazing random roll perks returned, the new raid was great, there were new subclass trees, the story was compelling, the very first dungeon was introduced, Gambit was really popular at first, and both of the new locations were very impressive. Player morale was at a high for the first time since Taken King, but believe it or not, this was the time where things really started to take a turn for the worse. A few months after the expansion, Bungie parted ways with Activision, who had been publishing the game and working with them since Destiny 1. At the time, players rejoiced, and everyone thought this would allow Bungie to make the game reach that huge potential that we always knew it had. Unfortunately though, the split with Activision also meant that Bungie lost the support of 2 major studios who were helping them make the game, and thus, the next year did not contain a lot of content.
Dude, those were 2, especially Vicarious Visions, man. I mean, big. Vicarious Visions, they shipped out whole expansions damn near on their own. Vicarious Visions did Eater of Worlds. I want to say they did Eater of Worlds. They also did Menagerie, that entire expansion. Escalation Protocol, for better or worse. Yeah, so I want to say Vicarious also did all of Season of Opulence. Could be wrong, but let's continue.
Seasons became less involved, they no longer contained raids, and even the following expansions were significantly smaller than expected. This was evident in Shadowkeep, where the story left players with more questions than answers. It delivered no new destinations other than a reskinned moon from Destiny 1, and there was also a mediocre raid, nothing for Gambit, and essentially nothing for PvP. The game notably became free-to-play, which absolutely spiked the player counts to insane levels, but this also caused Bungie to drastically change their approach to game design. Instead of focusing on improving the core of the game like they did in the past, Bungie leadership was now focused exclusively on developing paid content. This meant that all free content, including PvP, would essentially get zero development. They basically gave zero attention to strikes, Gambit, and anything else that wasn't a part of a season or an expansion. Even Trials of Osiris, Destiny's most iconic PvP mode, returned in a terrible state with zero new loot and just some old reskins from Destiny 1. This decision to abandon the development of Destiny's core would prove itself to be one of the more damaging decisions for the game's future. Expansion after expansion, there would be literally zero PvP content, and this understandably led to most PvP players quitting the game. Nowadays, almost nobody plays the game for its PvP anymore, but back in the day, it was a much different story. PvP used to actually be respected and updated, and it was a huge part of the game for many players such as myself. Expansions used to bring us 8 PvP maps and a handful of new modes, but sadly, Bungie decided to alienate millions of players by completely abandoning PvP and reassigning their developers to instead work on Marathon. Another thing that irreparably damaged the game and its reputation was Bungie's refusal to deal with cheaters, even when they were completely overrunning the game. When Trials returned, you literally couldn't play a single card on PC without facing multiple teams of hackers who absolutely ruined the experience for everyone else. The Crucible became a total joke, and
ZK
yet again, PvP players felt—
Let me just be real though, ZK should have won that. I'm just saying, being in Primal, ZK, all he had was a sidearm.
Play a single card on PC without facing multiple teams of hackers who absolutely ruined the experience for everyone else. The Crucible became a total joke, and yet again, PvP players felt extremely disrespected and disappointed. The game had essentially zero anti-cheat, and for years, Bungie leadership simply refused to invest money in the security of their game. By the time they would finally partner with an anti-cheat company in 2021, many Crucible players had already quit the game out of frustration. Due to the split with Activision, Shadowkeep and the following seasons had very little content, and players were unhappy that Shadowkeep was so much smaller than Forsaken. Bungie leadership noticed this, and they concluded that they had actually over-delivered by releasing too much content in Forsaken. They thought that it was a mistake to create an amazing expansion like Forsaken because players now expected that future expansions would also be amazing and also have a large amount of content. So from this point onward, Bungie leadership decided that they would produce consistently mediocre content so that the player base would always know what to expect. Instead of letting their developers create something awesome, the leadership forced them to release a worse product. There were allegedly many situations where a team of developers wanted to go above and beyond and create something really cool, but then the leadership stepped in and told them, and I quote, "We should not ship this because it's an over-delivery that will set us up for failure in the future." Looking back, many players consider this the reason why Destiny has stagnated over the years. There was a lack of content, a severe lack of innovation, and no ambition for making anything that might actually shake things up and surprise us. Every single season felt identical because Bungie wanted to avoid over-delivery, but in the end, the repetitive and boring seasonal model would turn out to be extremely detrimental to the game. Many people even started misinterpreting this and calling Bungie lazy. But in reality, the hardworking and passionate developers were just being held back by their management. Following Destiny's move to become free-to-play, the presence of microtransactions and in-game monetization started to increase substantially. This had already become a contentious topic in the community, but players were becoming increasingly annoyed as Bungie added more and more items to their ever-expanding Eververse store. During the rest of the year of Shadowkeep, this happened, and therefore everyone went into lockdown and started playing a lot of video games. Bungie saw this as an opportunity to expand, an opportunity to grow beyond Destiny, and ultimately become a studio with multiple successful games. They went on an absolute spending spree, hiring hundreds of new employees and handing out hundreds of promotions to existing employees. In fact, they gave out so many promotions that there were now too many managers with big salaries and not enough people to do the actual work.
Yeah, dude, it was a lot of promotions. I felt like everybody was getting a promotion, and then so many teams were being added.
That is a direct quote from people who worked there, by the way. Like, they literally had too many higher-ups and not enough.
Now, let me also just say, it wasn't just Bungie. I mean, there's a reason why there's been a huge tech sector pullback across the board, man. Everybody was hiring. Everybody was getting PPP loans. And if you were a game developer, you had everybody at home playing your games. Dude, it was hiring sprees.
Real developers who would actually make the game. In addition to this, Bungie leadership started to mismanage their resources to an extreme degree. Instead of focusing their capital and efforts on Destiny 3, they instead spent millions of dollars developing new games that would ultimately never see the light of day. They took hundreds of talented developers away from working on Destiny and instead put them on all of these little incubation games. Many different projects were created, developed, expanded, and then destroyed, costing the studio an unfathomable amount of money. As one person described it, Bungie somehow seems to forget that they only have one product, yet they seem to put their focus towards everything except for that one thing making them money. Their senior leadership needs to be gutted. They simply don't have the first idea on how to run a gaming company, it seems. It wasn't just random people on the internet who thought this either, because internally there were reports of employees straight up telling the upper management that doing all of these incubation projects was not going to work out very well. When the Beyond Light expansion finally released in 2020, Bungie leadership made perhaps their greatest mistake of all time by removing huge chunks of content from the game. They actually took away a lot more content than they added. So this expansion was in fact not an expansion, it was actually a contraction. The removal of content and the so-called Destiny Content Vault was easily the most hated thing they've ever done, and all of this content simply got deleted. Like, just look at the amount of stuff they removed. Bungie claimed that removing the content was necessary, and maybe it was, but it had an extreme ripple effect that crippled the game for years to come. It also had a massively negative impact on player sentiment, with one popular comment reading, "They lost my trust and I stopped playing when they removed the campaign we paid for." That's theft, literally. There were hundreds of videos and articles just absolutely roasting the game for deleting its own content, and you've got to understand, it is not normal for an MMO to do this. Destiny quickly got the reputation for being that game that deletes its own content, and this was a massive meme in the broader gaming community.
Man, I tell you what, dude. The sunsetting thing, there was just no way you could sell that. And then supposedly, a huge reason why sunsetting existed was because of the technical limitations that Bungie was faced with. You know, something about data caps and whatnot, the size of the game being too big. And in some ways, we've kind of experienced that in the past couple years where content hasn't been cut out of the game, but, you know, spaghetti code and things going haywire and crazy. But I feel like, one, that was completely lost. Like that dialogue where, hey, these are the technical limitations of Destiny. We want to add more content. We're having to take away this content. At first, that dialogue was lost. Secondly, when you hear you're taking away my stuff, there's no way you can paint that in a good light. And look, there's data caps on everything. Consoles is the biggest limiter for this kind of stuff. Separating file sizes is how they've been able to. Some of these games have big file sizes. That's how they work around it.
But from the gamer's perspective, it simply sucks to buy things and then have them taken away a couple years later. Existing players of the game were obviously unhappy about the removal of content, but the people who got hurt the most were actually the new players. Since such a large portion of the game's history just got deleted, it became extremely difficult for new players to get started and understand what is going on in the game. With almost all of the story no longer existing, Destiny's narrative became extremely confusing because you could no longer experience all of the events in the timeline. The vast majority of free-to-play content was also gutted, so new players became far less likely to actually get deep into the game and want to buy the expansions. The new player experience as a whole was just an unmitigated catastrophe, and somehow Bungie leadership decided that they were okay with this. Year after year, nothing would be done to improve the new player experience. New players are essential to keeping any live service game alive, and it blows my mind that Bungie leadership did not invest a single dollar into fixing this absolute disaster. There have been thousands of Reddit posts where a new player joins the game, gets completely lost, and then
How the heck do you play this game as a new player? I bought Destiny 2 Humble Bundle. Oh my gosh, LMFAO. What is this game? How do you even play? I'm reading years old posts complaining of the new player experience, and it's true. Haha, I have no idea what I'm doing. Kind of makes me regret buying the bundle. Hopefully it explains everything better later on, because I do want to play it. I bought it to play with friends. Anybody checked on Roly Poly TV? See how he's doing today? Somebody just check on him. See how he's doing. Ask him what else does he quit in life. I want to know. You just make it halfway through a shit and just zip it up. Say, I'm done. I'll just save this for later.
And then quits because the game is so unbelievably confusing and literally nothing is explained. I have 2 different million-view videos explaining exactly what is wrong with the new player.
No, I'm gonna just say this. The new player experience could be better. I'm too biased. I've played this game for too long. I don't really know exactly what the new player experience is like. Even if I was to start over on a fresh account, in my brain, we already know exactly where we're gonna go, how we're gonna optimize, things like that. But let me also just say this. When picking up any MMO, the new player experience is really kind of painful because you're learning. You're having to learn a bunch of shit. I will say cutting out content and not having that narrative thread to carry you through, that is a big pain point. That shouldn't exist. Or it should exist. The campaigns should exist to keep everyone on the same page. But picking up any MMO has always been somewhat of a struggle bus, at least for like the first couple weeks.
Experience. I basically spoon-fed the exact list of issues to Bungie, but still, their leadership decided to do nothing. They would eventually add a couple small tweaks like the Guardian rank system, but quite truthfully, these things did not move the needle for improving the new player experience. In other news, the Beyond Light expansion continued the trend of neglecting PvP by removing 11 maps instead of adding any new ones. Especially considering the introduction of the overpowered Stasis subclass, PvP got infinitely worse as a result of this expansion. This was especially obvious if you ever watched the best players in the world, because the only 2 times that they would lose a game is if they lost to a cheater or if they lost to Stasis. Bungie was also famous for being extremely slow at fixing any of the issues with their game, and this time was no exception. It took an entire year for the broken Stasis abilities to finally get balanced. Frustrating would be an understatement. Later in the year, Bungie finally introduced a much-desired transmog system that allowed you to customize your appearance. This would have been cause for much more celebration, but unfortunately, Bungie decided to limit how many ornaments you could get for free at just 10 per season. If you wanted to get any more than that, you would have to purchase additional currencies from the Eververse store with real money, greatly upsetting the player base and reigniting the backlash against the Eververse store. It was still nice to have transmog now in the game, but somehow it also ended up being quite a controversy. The initial reception of the Witch Queen expansion was quite positive, with the new legendary campaign being a major addition, and it had people saying that this was the best expansion since Forsaken. We also got some really unique exotics, a couple of new activities, and the new Throne World destination. It did become clear, however, that people were starting to get significantly burned out on the game after the initial honeymoon period wore off. The story was extremely excellent, but Bungie continued to avoid over-delivery by delivering essentially nothing for the core of the game. PvP got literally no updates except for a loading screen, Gambit got downgraded, and I think we got like 1 or 2 new strikes, so overall, people were not very satisfied. With all of that aside though, this expansion did introduce a new weapon crafting mechanic that initially people were extremely excited for. It let you get whatever perks you wanted on your weapons, and this was amazing. After some time passed though, more people started to realize that this would significantly reduce the replayability of the game for dedicated players. Although people did like crafting the weapons to get amazing perk rolls, the crafting system also made much of the game's loot completely irrelevant. For instance, if you crafted all of the raid weapons, you no longer had any incentive to ever run any of the raids ever again. Before crafting existed, many dedicated players always loved the prospect of potentially one day getting that perfectly rolled weapon to drop from a raid, but after the introduction of crafting, all of that loot chase was removed. Something that really started to annoy players around this time was the repetitive nature of the seasonal model. For years now, we had been leveling up these random tables, unlocking our Battle Pass rewards, replaying some boring seasonal activity 50 times, and then slowly progressing through some time-gated story missions. Burnout was high, and as players continued to leave the game, Bungie was losing a lot of money. And as a response to this, Bungie decided to spend even more money. Even though almost all of their employees were working remotely, they decided to spend an unfathomable amount of money building physical studios and massively increasing the size of their buildings. They doubled the size of their studio to be over 200,000 square feet, built an entire new office in Amsterdam, and also started leasing multiple floors of the massive 2+U tower. Bungie would go on to become a quote, digital-first company, and a huge portion of their employees were working from home. So all of this new physical office space would end up being seen as a very lavish and unnecessary expense. We will talk about the layoffs a bit later, but suffice it to say,
I will say this about the office space, and this is by no means an excuse, but from what I've heard, the contract was signed and for the big studio, the one he's talking about in Bellevue, was signed in 2019. So it was before COVID hit. And so that move was already locked in. And you sign leases for those things. I don't know how long of a lease, maybe a 10-year lease or something. So I don't think no one expected COVID.
Employees were very upset when they found out that Bungie decided to upgrade their headquarters instead of paying their salaries. Due to their insane financial illiteracy, it became clear that Bungie would be unable to pay off their debts and that they would soon become insolvent. After wasting hundreds of millions of dollars on failed incubation projects, insane promotions, huge new buildings, and hundreds of new employees, the company found itself in an extremely difficult position. They were desperate for someone to come bail them out of this nightmare, and then luckily, Sony agreed to buy them for $3.6 billion. This was a huge moment for the survival of the company, but even after the acquisition, Bungie really didn't fix any of the problems that caused them to become insolvent in the first place. They kept investing crazy money into making new games instead of working on Destiny. They kept ignoring the core game modes, they kept ignoring the terrible new player experience, and they just hoped that things would magically get better. There were reports of employees literally begging the leadership to make the changes that players wanted, but these cries for help were sadly ignored. Leadership clearly had an overly ambitious pipe dream of making Bungie a multi-IP studio that would have like 5 games going all at once. But unfortunately, this ambition led to the decline of the one IP that was actually making all of their money. Surprise, surprise, it turns out that trying to fund 5 games by siphoning money away from Destiny is probably not the greatest idea in the long run. The studio was losing money and operating in the red, and eventually, layoffs would become inevitable. Destiny's next major expansion, called Lightfall, was hyped up about as much as any expansion could possibly be hyped. Major streamers were playing the game for the first time in years, and many people decided to give the game a second chance. Destiny was nearing the end of its first massive story that had been building up for 8 years now, and everyone was excited to see what would happen next. As it turned out though, this was probably the worst possible time for people to return to the game. While visually—
Dude, why does this happen? Every time Destiny is like in the spotlight, it's like D1 vanilla, D2 vanilla, Lightfall. It's like just missing the free throw. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. Because here's the thing, I would have loved for everyone to have tried Final Shape. And there's a lot of people that tried Final Shape. The numbers for Final Shape were really good. It was just, it was 3 months late. But the hype for Lightfall was so huge, man. We hyped it up too. We thought it was going to be, Avengers Infinity War. We thought it was going to be our Infinity War.
Stunning, the much anticipated Lightfall campaign was universally hated. The narrative did not push the game forward in any significant direction, and instead, it just talked about this thing called the Veil without ever explaining to us what the Veil actually was. Bife put out a scathing video that went trending on YouTube to talk about just how bad the storytelling really was. Unfortunately, the hype to disappointment ratio was probably higher now than it had ever been in the franchise's history. Nobody was happy, and one popular comment from the time said, "Well, we've got to give it to Bungie for successfully meeting their criteria of under-delivering." As time went on, the failure of Lightfall would lead to many people not being interested in playing the following seasons, or even the following expansions. People lost all faith in Bungie's ability to tell a story, and players really did not have a lot of hope for the future. As Bungie continued to deliver their cookie-cutter seasonal formula, which wasn't impressing anyone, the player count headed towards all-time lows. The state of the game was a post that dropped in the summer, and people were furious that it realistically delivered more bad news than good news. At a time when we desperately needed to be reassured about the future, the article basically just said yeah, we aren't doing much for PvP, strikes are getting a tiny update, and Gambit is not popular, so we aren't doing anything there. It's almost like Bungie had the Pikachu surprise face when they realized that Gambit and PvP were not popular anymore after they were literally ignored for 5 years. The following showcase for the Final Shape expansion was also pretty underwhelming, as it did not show off any new subclasses, enemies, or gameplay systems that would notably change the overall experience. A little while later, Bungie responded to the outrage by assembling a mini PvP team to improve the Crucible. But the truth is, this was far too little and far too late. As I explained earlier, the vast majority of PvP players quit years ago due to the clear pattern of neglect, and ultimately this promise of a new PvP team was not going to convince them to come back. Around this time, the loot chase for Destiny became almost non-existent. The harsh truth is that almost nobody's going to be excited about the 200th SMG that is only 1% different from all of the others. Especially with the crafting system giving players access to all of the best perks, many activities just didn't feel as rewarding anymore. After you crafted the new weapons from any given season, there was simply no incentive to play anymore, and people were definitely getting bored. In the fall of 2023, things became more dire than ever before as Bungie laid off a sizable portion of their company, parting ways with massively important employees such as the incredible music composer Michael Salvatori. At this point, it became publicly known that Bungie's leadership was absolutely awful, and employees shared terrible stories about mismanagement and poor decision-making. There were multiple tweets of current and former employees just blasting the CEO and the leadership team for their actions. Someone allegedly asked Bungie leadership if they would consider reducing their salary to prevent layoffs, and then they answered that Bungie was, quote, not that type of company. At the same time that this was happening, Bungie CEO Pete Parsons was actively spending millions of dollars on all of these expensive cars, and not even considering the possibility of reducing his own insanely high salary. Leadership at Bungie appeared to care more about their own wealth and car collections than about paying their hard-working employees. In the spring, Bungie released a lot of new content to fill the gap before the Final Shape expansion. This was called Into the Light, and it brought back a ton of non-craftable loot that players were actually very excited to get. This period leading up to the Final Shape was quite a high point, and players couldn't wait to experience what would be coming with the conclusion of Destiny's main saga. We all had very high hopes because Bungie publicly announced that they were trying to make this expansion one of the best of all time. The Final Shape expansion launched in June 2024, and man, it was an absolutely incredible experience.
Oh my god, it was what a time,
conclusion to the story, an awesome new destination inside of the Traveler, and a whole bunch of nostalgia that wrapped up the last 10 years of Destiny. With their backs against the wall, Bungie was forced to finally make something awesome, and they arguably over-delivered for the first time since Forsaken. Despite its amazing reception though, the expansion did not sell very well, and actually it sold even worse than Lightfall.
Cade deserved better? No. The conclusion with Cade, I thought was beautiful. I truly thought it was beautiful. I love what the narrative that was being driven, the core of that, which is, you know, that he wanted to decide his own fate. Believe me, I would want Cade to be around forever, but he took his own fate into his own hands, and that was what was so beautiful with that.
Despite its amazing reception though, the expansion did not sell very well, and actually it sold even worse than Lightfall.
Let me add some context to this. The Final Shape sold just as well as Lightfall. It was just 3 months late. The Final Shape arguably made more money than Lightfall. It was 3 months late.
After all of the negativity about the layoffs, the failure of Lightfall, and the repetitive seasonal model, many people were scared that Bungie would disappoint them once again. The nail in the coffin, though, was the fact that this represented the end of the road for many longtime players. The story was concluded, the loot was acquired, the objectives were reached. There really wasn't that much to do, and Bungie didn't announce anything about the future of Destiny. Tons of people were sticking around until the conclusion to see things through, but with the Final Shape now complete, they felt like they had reached the end of their journey as Guardians. There were top Reddit posts saying things like, "I paid for this year's content and I can't even will myself to play it." Kind of like Avengers Endgame, this was kind of just a natural ending point for many players, and Bungie massively messed up by not announcing the future to keep people interested. We lost players at a rate faster than Lightfall, and actually faster than ever before. Due to the financial underperformance of the expansion, Bungie leadership had to lay off another wave of employees, this time parting ways with even more people than last time. CEO Pete Parsons was reportedly flexing his exotic cars in the faces of employees literally 2 days before he laid them off. Due to this incident and many others, his current and former employees were seen publicly roasting him on Twitter, with countless examples like this one saying, "Pete is a joke." A few days later, it was also revealed that Destiny 3 was never in development, and this ultimately crushed the hopes of many players. Due to Bungie spending all of their money on Marathon and their new studio and a ton of failed incubation projects, they didn't have any left over to build Destiny's future. If they didn't do all of those things, they could have easily built Destiny 3 over the past few years, but instead, Bungie now finds themselves in a situation where their only source of revenue is dying faster than ever before. The decision to not develop Destiny 3 will easily go down as one of the greatest fumbles in game development history, and it lies entirely at the feet of Bungie's terrible leadership. You might think that any logical company would just replace their terrible leadership, but unfortunately, it seems that Bungie is not a very logical company. The CEO and other board members just remained in place despite everyone, including their own employees, literally begging for their replacement. Bungie leadership needs to actually face some sort of consequences for their failures. This is ridiculous. The new episodic content model for D2 turned out to be exactly the same as the seasonal model, except now there would be even less content coming out on a yearly basis. Bungie acted like they were giving us an exciting new gift, but then they just gave us the exact same shirt that we've been wearing for the past 7 years. Following this, the player sentiment became infinitely worse than ever before, and so did the player population. With notable examples like the Encore mission, Destiny has also started to become extremely buggy in the past few months. You might be wondering why this happened, and according to former community manager Liana, they have laid off their entire player support team. The cheaters are even making somewhat of a comeback due to Bungie getting rid of a large portion of their security team. I predict that things will continue to become more and more broken due to the complete absence of some of these teams, and unfortunately, this is going to cause even more frustration among the community. If you take a look a little bit deeper into the game's gradual decline over the past few years, it becomes clear that Destiny doesn't really have an audience anymore. The veteran players are tired of the repetition, and new players are incapable of joining us due to the laughably bad new player experience. There simply aren't any new players joining us to replace the veterans who are quitting. One person wrote, "Before Beyond Light, nearly every friend I tried to get into Destiny stuck around. Since Beyond Light, not one. Literally not one person I've helped get into the game played for longer than a few weeks. They never played by themselves, only when I was on. They just never had a clue what to do, no matter how much I tried to help guide them. The game has ballooned so much and become so convoluted and confusing that it is completely unapproachable for anyone who doesn't have a PhD in Destinology from playing the game for the past 10 years. I really don't know what else to say. The new player experience has become one of the single largest contributors to Destiny's decline, and Bungie's leadership refuses to do anything about it. The only other thing to consider is perhaps the returning player population, but it turns out that the game has become so overcomplicated and unexplained that their experience isn't too great either. Quote, "As a lapsed player, Bungie made it so hard to get back in if you lapse. For new players, it was almost impossible. It was a fundamental business mistake to not attract new players. It was an ever-dwindling pie."
Can I just say this? I took off during the Taken King. I got hit with live stuff. I actually didn't get to play the Taken King at launch, which was unfortunate because things were popping off and everybody loved it. But at the time, I was just tied up with live stuff. I came back though during the April update, which is funny because I don't think that update even had a name. It just was coined as the April update. And that was the first time I had picked Destiny up. And even in D1, and I'm not giving Destiny 2 an out right now, but even that lapse in Destiny 1, it was a struggle for me for months to really embed myself back again, like to get to where I needed to be, to get into King's Fall, to find a raid team, to find people that were willing to play with me and things like Trials of Osiris at the time. It had just been so long. Luckily, I had like 2 friends that were still playing Destiny, and eventually they ended up, helping me get through King's Fall. But it was hard to get into again. So what point I'm trying to make with that is that I think at every point in Destiny's life, it's been a difficult game to jump back into when you've taken, a vacation from it. especially for anywhere around, 5-6 months.
The other thing I've realized is that if you return to the game, you basically just do whatever is new, and then you realize that the core game and the seasonal model still hasn't seen any innovation or improvement for the past 7 years. And then you probably quit again, because who wants to do the same things for 7 years straight? We still have quests where you fly to the helm, then fly to Ikora, then fly to the helm again, and then you watch some boring dialogue on a holoprojector, and then you fly to Nessus, and then you fly back to the helm for a third time, and then you go do a public event. There has been so little innovation for so long that players have grown tired of it, and the quality bar is actually on the floor.
I hate that this is kind of what Destiny 2 has become. I want a reason to log in and play and grind. I want fun things to do in the game, but there just really isn't.
Despite the game being in a far worse state than ever before, some people think that Destiny is
Charlie with the robe right there. What?
still doing fine. And I've seen a few statements like, oh, this happens every year, we'll be back to normal in a few months. I normally try to be pretty optimistic, but in this case, I'm sad to say that things are really different this time. Never before have content creators been forced to leave the game because they're literally unable to pay their basic bills. Many of us have started covering new games and slowly abandoning the Destiny franchise. Personally, back in June, I was all in. I was so optimistic about covering this game because I thought that Bungie was developing a future for it. Unfortunately, nowadays though, I'm questioning whether it will even be possible to make Destiny videos as a full-time job anymore. There are roughly 50 full-time creators covering this game, but as of September, all of them have either been covering new games or they are reaching record low view counts. Based on all of the data and all of the analytics that I have access to, it's clear that players have never been less interested in playing the game. The one thing that Destiny does have going for it is that there is really no serious competition. There are, of course, some comparisons like Warframe, but nothing really comes close to Destiny's universe, gunplay, and power fantasy. I assume that players will probably return to Destiny every now and then to reevaluate the game, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the best days of Destiny 2 are now behind us. We've lost players every year for the past 2 years.
Shadow, I refuse to accept it. I refuse to accept it. It's not dead. We will go down with the ship if we have to, but it ain't fucking dead yet. The best days? Get the fuck out of here.
We are currently losing players faster than ever before, and it seems that we will continue to lose players as we go into the future. The game certainly will not disappear overnight, but it also will not see any form of major revival anytime soon. I asked players on Twitter about this and requested that people tell me what it would take to get them back into Destiny. So many people answered with Destiny 3 that it literally started trending on the platform. It is abundantly clear that millions of players would come back for Destiny 3, but due to Bungie's poor
Dude, Bungie, just call it Destiny 3. Call the next expansion. Just say, fuck it, it's Destiny 3. But make it just like Destiny 2. Nothing different. Just call it Destiny 3. Just do it.
leadership decisions, Destiny 3 will come out years into the future, if it even comes out at all.
And you know what's so crazy? Can I tell you this? This is what's so crazy. Bungie could call the next Destiny 2 expansion Destiny 3. And look, unless we, the veteran players, call it out, I guarantee you some players will actually join up, play the game, and go, wow, this is kind of good, while still playing exactly what the fuck we've been playing. Look, I'm not saying that a D3 isn't necessary. I'm not saying that a D3 wouldn't spice things back up. But I also believe that D3 is an onboarding point. A lot of players feel like that they have, been out of the loop for too long, and they're just looking for that next onboarding moment. And I would say, like, from a business perspective, D3 would be great. Yeah.
I do also want to say that Destiny has a lot of unrealized potential. It might even have more potential than any other game on the market. We have great gunplay, build crafting, characters, lore, space magic, and an amazing foundation for PvP that was simply never capitalized on. We have all of the puzzle pieces that could make up an incredible game, but Bungie has never quite put the pieces together in the right way. They have come close with expansions like Forsaken, and if they ever get it completely right, they will have an absolute masterpiece on their hands. I hope you enjoyed hearing this story about the fall of my favorite game, and I want to let you know that we recently spent over 1,000 hours creating an insane movie about the entire evolution of Destiny. I highly recommend that you watch that video now, and also please leave a like, because for
Good video, Shadow. Thank you for that. We'll have links to that video, this video right here that we just watched, the Fall of Destiny 2. I personally don't think this is it for Destiny. I know I'm biased. Okay. But we're going to ride this bitch all the way down if we have to.
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.